Okay, thanks everyone for being here. I'm Yann Lebeau from the University of East Anglia, and I'll be a co-convener of that panel this afternoon with my colleague Vincent Carpentier from the Institute of Education at UCL. Also on the panel this afternoon with us are Mario Azevedo, who is online, joining us from Brazil, and Kirsten Jaeger, who is also online and joining us from Denmark. And we've also got our colleague Hanne, Tange, who is also from the University of Aalborg and joining us here, and Abass Isiaka from the University of East Anglia. Very quickly, we've got 4 presentations. We're 5 on the panel. We've got 4 presentations. So our plan is to present those 4 presentations in succession with very limited time in between for questions. So if you have a burning question specifically focused on the presentation, almost technical question, we can pick that question before we go to the next presentation. But generally speaking, we will aim to go towards the end. What you will see is that we've extracted from our presentations suggestions of 1 or 2 questions or provocations, presentations that we hope will help guide the debate in the end. So we hope to have about 30 minutes of discussion towards the end. We will put those questions on screen so you can connect your questions or your comments to those guiding questions if you like. If you've got something else you would like to raise that is outside what we are suggesting, that's absolutely fine as well. But the idea is to have more of a debate, more of a discussion, rather than questions targeted to particular paper. So less of a Q&A and more of a debate if we can. I think on that note, I will hand over to our first speaker, first presentation, 15 minutes over to you, Vincent, and I'll let you introduce your case.
Okay. Welcome everyone, really great pleasure here, and to engage with this question of a national international interface, as we call it, constructing the panel. So just like very briefly before I do my presentation, just to talk about the panel perspectives. I mean, we had like discussion while doing our paper and trying to be as integrated as possible, and like some connection between what we wanted to do about this question of the national international interface. So, like a lot of a panel, actually, this idea of polycrisis is an important part of what we want to discuss. We were interested about this connection and tension between the international. Our papers as well talked about some emerging trends that or some of them are completely new, or some others are just like historical re-emergence. So I just like give you an idea with de-internationalization, the idea of forced internationalization, question of neo-nationalism that has been discussed in the previous panel this morning, and also this question of sustainable and inclusive internationalization. We think they are the important kind of issues that are characterizing higher education. So in our title, we have this idea of post-neoliberal global age landscape, whatever that means, in the sense that you have to define all of these concepts and what is post and what is the neoliberal. But that's the kind of logic we wanted to think about, like this idea of post-neoliberal global higher education. So that's something that we can discuss together. The approaches we've got, an idea of historical perspective, mainly my paper about massification and internationalization. And I'm going to stay within the 10 minutes, so stop me when the paper. I have a few graphs, so those of you who know me are not surprised. That's why I'm glad PowerPoint works, because otherwise I'm in big trouble. And the other aspect is this idea of multi-scalar approach and internationalization, with this idea of regulation, and Abass and Yann are going mainly to talk about that. But I think we all engage with this question of the various level of internationalization. And then this reversal perspective on global HE fields, it's this idea that we're coming from very different kind of perspective as well, and we don't think there's one kind of discourse on single lens. All the idea is to kind of compare and contrast and confront those lenses on global HE field. And Mario, for example, is going to talk about the dynamic of the global South and Brazil, and Kirsten and Hanne would look at the case of Denmark. Okay, so I've been too long already, so I'm going to just like give you a little bit like on take. I'm going to concentrate on the UK and France without specific country, high-income country, massified system already. A lot of similarities in terms of internal, but at the same time, like some clear specificities as well. I'm just like giving you my kind of take on historical take, is this idea of internationalization being affected by the crisis of globalization, and at the same time a crisis of the funding of higher education. So it's a crisis of education, of higher education, also a wider crisis, and internationalization and HE system are in the middle of that. So what I'm going to think about is this idea of higher education and internationalization as contributor, but also receiver of global inequality within and between countries, and also through the case of France and the US, some recurrent questions and tension put to higher education system and internationalization in relation to immigration, neo-nationalism, but also a kind of clash or rationales between income generation, tourism, etc. So that's the question. So the question maybe I ask is one about the looking back at that notion, national global interface in the two countries. I'm doing that by looking at massification and internationalization, and I go back to in the 1920s in some way. So I'm just going here, and I think it'd be important for maybe to give like a kind of historical context from those two countries, which are again very specific in their relation to higher education. Yeah, okay, you see better than I do. Just a graph here to illustrate in a way the long-term trends of enrollments in higher education in both systems. And here I've distinguished home students and international students in both countries. And what you can see in that is like clearly a considerable expansion of the number of international students in both countries. Also, this idea that there is a kind of synchronicity. You look at the long term between the two groups like of students over the long term. What you can see as well is some heavy fluctuation and shocks, even you can say. In this graph, you probably have the history of higher education, the history of those countries and the history of the world. So there's wars, empires, migration, funding crises, etc. So I think what's quite interesting as well is that you've got fluctuations which are much sharper for international students than domestic students. So I asked the question whether there's been dynamic of shock absorption in some way. Another important thing, I think, is the impact of economic crisis on those dynamics of enrollment and the link between the two. And I identified the 1930s crisis, 1973, and 2008, which I think can explain a lot of the development we got in higher education and internationalization since then. And, mainly the idea that 2008 has not been resolved in some point, so it's still in that dynamic. Then the question of intensity, just to give you an idea as well of, we always ask how internationalized systems are. What you can see is really like fluctuation in intensity. You can see as well that all these systems have always been international. There's always been like a fair amount proportion of international students in those systems. Again, strong fluctuation, and which are the results in some ways of the trends in massification and internationalization. I think it's quite important, especially in the been some debate in the UK, but higher intensity doesn't mean necessarily more international students. It can be also fluctuation in the number of home students as well. And, there's been like a phenomenon like that across history. What you can see as well is like the huge rise of intensity in the UK compared to France since the early 2000s. Another aspect I wanted just to maybe discuss or just give you some idea is about the link between institutional differentiation and internationalization as well. So here you've got the proportion of international students in the different type of institutions within the UK system, and you can see similar fluctuation, different according to the effect of policies, or there is dynamic as well linked to international student choice in some ways, but as well the kind of institutional reaction to policy, for example, to changes in funding regime or things like that. I don't have a graphic of France, but you've got also very much big difference between the kind of institutions. And the main receiver international student are the universities in France, which are not like the elite institution like it would be in other systems. And you've got also an increase international student within an emerging new kind of business school in France at the moment at the elite level as well. And you probably know that there's been a lot of debate because fees have been introduced for international students in France. Interestingly, they haven't been implemented fully because some institutions refused to do so. It shows as well difference of income generation according to country. Probably, and this is linked as well to the dynamic of internationalization, massification, and marketization. And what I wanted to say here is, I think a lot of what we're discussing in higher education at the moment is also linked to that historic dynamic, at least for these two countries that you can see, but that would be the same in many countries, is a steep decline of public funding in higher education systems. 90% of income was from public sources in the UK in 1973. It's about 20 now. So, clearly this has an influence. My own view is there's been a shift from what was cost sharing of funding in higher education towards a public-private substitution, where actually additional resources are substitutive private resources are substitutive rather than additional. And internationalization was part of that. I mean, starting the process in cost sharing, and has been a driver of that, and I would say a victim as well of that shift in some ways. I've already talked about France, so I think I'm already there. So
keep going.
Some reflections. Really, it's just like historical contingency shows that internationalization is both at the same time an experimentation for some HE systems, and at the same time an intensifier of existing transformation. So my view in relation, if you see that in the graph that I showed, is that there's a potential for considering internationalization as central. What I mean central, I mean like a key part, and not as a reactive kind of variable in the massification, but as a central driver and part, not something ad hoc in some ways. So although people, and they are right, saying funding is not everything, and my view is like starting with an increase of public funding would be a good start, actually, to try to rebalance this kind of funding dynamic, and at the same time to try to alleviate the tensions between international massification and working towards a massified, cosmopolitan and inclusive public service of higher education. As I say, it's part of the wider movement as well, but funding is a trigger. We've seen that to implement some way where this national global interface is something that is constitutive of the system rather than reaction to some of these problems. That's not true.
Thank you. So, unless there's any immediate question for Vincent, as I said, we have plenty of time. We hope to get back to this presentation and others as well. I will move on. We are going to move on to our next presentation, and we're going to change perspective, moving to Brazil and getting a southern perspective on the question of internationalization and the national system. So, Mario, I hope you can hear us well. You now.
Mario, if you want, I move the slides for you. You just let me know, okay?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Vincent. So, if please, could you move him? Yeah. So, firstly, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to sharing my thoughts about internationalization of higher education. Firstly, it's almost shocking maps, but the landscape of global science and the knowledge production is starkly uneven. The first map in the left part is the global north and the global south from the Brent report 1908, and the other side is a map about how or from where the production of science is created or is produced. So it's just a contrast to show that global north and the global south, we live almost in a very uneven world. So please, Vincent, could you pass? So this is just to definition about, but this visually represented by this map based in scientific output, we could see this uneven situation. So I argue that traditional, often North-centric models of internationalization are potentially detrimental for global South. Instead, in this presentation or in this communication, I try to demonstrate that there is another approach rooted in mutual respect, cooperation, equity, and decolonial perspectives, highlighting that there is a potential from South-South collaboration, South-South cooperation as an alternative in this relationship. So please, could you move, Vincent? Yes. For illustrating that, I ask for Joseph Conrad, the novel Heart of Darkness. I think you know very well this. But just to remember that culture from Europe could perceive there is difference between South and the North in the cultural field. There are some phrases from this novel. But what is interesting, this is just highlight that in this novel, what is very marked is efficiency and ideas, in the sense that I try to make a correspondence between gestion, administration, efficiency, and ideas of civilization, ideas of from a Eurocentric thoughts could shape the new world, or Africa, Latin America, or even Asia. So the historical roots of this imbalance are deep, echoing colonial encounters. We could say even an imperialism. And Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness offer a literary illustration. The narrative contrasts the colonizers' self-perception as barrier of efficiency and ideas with the brutal reality of conquest. Marlowe is a character, is a central character in this novel. Say he is like an emissary of light, and he is Marlowe. He have the ambition to meet Kurds. And the definition of Kurds is, you could see in these slides, he's like a representation of Europe in Africa. This was because it could speak English to me, and the original Kurds had been educated partly in England. His mother was half English, his father was half French. All Europe contributed to making of Kurds. The International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance. Kurds, in this novel, is retreated with admiration for all the world. And there is a character, the name is a Russian, there isn't a name for this Russian character, but for him, evidently, Mr. Kurtz was not in his grave, he is not dead. I suspect that for him, Mr. Kurtz was one of the immortals. He's like a universal values from Europe. If I dare to this that with Joseph Conrad's novel. So please, could you advance, Vincent? So in this traditional definition of internationalization are often rooted in global North perspectives. Like that, there is inequality, underfunding, consumerism is what we live here in the global South. Pollution, historical disadvantages, commodification, financialization, assetization, monetization, rentism, and we have to say that authoritarian populism or new nationalisms or new imperialisms, if I can say that, and geopolitics, including knowledge politics, geopolitics of knowledge. And what is interesting is I try to develop this in another paper, but we live in this 20th century, in the 21st century, it's not new, it's a knowledge-based enclosure economy, as opposed by a common good or public good. So the perspectives for global South, or for the world, if you want, is a mutual respect, cooperation, the colonial futures, and the sustainable solidarity and equitable internationalization. After that, against this backdrop, alternative perspectives and models for internationalization are emerging from and for the global South. These envision a future built on mutual respect, genuine cooperation, or pursuit of the colonial futures. The goal is a form of internationalization of higher education that is sustainable, solidarity, and fundamentally equitable. Sorry for repeat that. This requires moving beyond the Northern dominated frameworks and embracing diverse intellectual traditions and philosophies. And the concepts such as Ernest Bloch's concrete utopia, emphasizing hope and achievable potential, and more important, the root of this word, concrete, is not in material in the sense actual that concrete is material. No, the root for this word is from Latin, concrescere, that means growth together, create together, living together. So sometimes when we read this word concrete, it remit or show only material, but it's not only that. The soul of that is growth together. And no Western philosophical tradition also provide powerful alternative frameworks. And we remember here Paulo Freire's Inédito Viável, or Untested Feasibility, highlighting the possibility of creating new realities. Paulo Freire offers inspiration in this new utopia for internationalization of higher education. And there is the Chinese concept of Tianxia, or under heaven, suggesting global harmony and the rationality, and the relationality, and Margison and the others works about this concept. This Chinese concept is very, very interesting. Remember the common good also. And the African philosophy of Ubuntu, emphasizing interconnectedness, community, and shared humanity. And the last one is the Latin American concept of bem viver, buen vivir, living well, focusing on community, ecological balance, and the spiritual satisfaction over material accumulation. All point towards more holistic, equitable, and relational approaches to global engagement, including in higher education and the knowledge production. So, in stark contrast to Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which portrays the colonial encounters, a kind of imperialism, as a descent into a chaotic and morally corrupting wilderness in this novel, having solidarity as premise for a relationship between Global South and North-South too. But the Global South people envisions a future where collaboration, sorry for repeat this, mutual respect and shared values drive a sustainable, inclusive, and equitable development as an utopia that can reveal the true core and the soul of cooperating with the Global South. And please, Vincent. So I try to demonstrate here some examples from Latin American BRICS and the Brazilian experience in the Global South cooperation. First one, between organizations, between institutions in regional networks, like the Montevideo Group of Universities Association. This association is formed by universities from Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. This association was created in 1991. The second, it's not so recognized, this Zicosur Universitário, but it's very interesting, this example, because it's not it's in Latin America, but it's not from São Paulo, Buenos Aires, or the big capitals in South America, but it's the is the association in the South America Central West Integration Zone. Parts of Paraná in the state of Brazil, Mato Grosso do Sul, it's the other state of Mato Grosso do Sul, and universities from Paraguay, the north of Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, and some universities from Peru. And there is one from Uruguay, is UDELAR. So the third example for that is from BRICS. The BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the new partners, you know. This organization or this association try to build two interesting institutions. Is the BRICS Network University and the BRICS League of Universities. So is the third one. The fourth is Mercosul Educacional. Great part of you know this. This is from Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela. They try to integrate the systems of these countries. But we are, if I can say that, we are a little bit in a recession now because of the nationalism in Brazil, for example, from Bolsonaro, and now is Milei in Argentina. So we are not in a very good situation, but there is Mercosul Educacional is an example of integration South in global South here. And there is others from Federal University of Minas Gerais, with the support of Isiaka of UNESCO. This university offer a PhD formation for Latin American countries. Brazil specifically, we have some example experience in South-South cooperation. Firstly, is Student Agreement Program, PEC-G. Normally, this PEC-G is for undergraduate students from Africa and Latin America. It's free of charge. And one thing is very interesting that this program try to avoid brain drain. After the formation, we have to return for your country. And for PhD and the master, there is another postgraduate student agreement for the same countries in global South. Inside Brazil, from 2010, the Federal University for Latin American Integration, UNILA, a good example inside Brazil, inviting professors, lecturers, and students to stay in Brazil. And UNILA is in Foz do Iguaçu, the Paraná state. UNILAB is in the northwest of Brazil, is university for international integration of the Afro-Brazilian Lusophony. UNILAB see more African students from Africa and for the people Brazilian, but for African students mainly. Another experience in South-South cooperation is Portuguese-speaking African countries, PALOP, and the CPLP, the Community of Portuguese-Speaking Countries. And we have some experience in that. The difference, Portugal is in this institution, in this association, but it's important too. It's experience of global North and the global South. The last one is in this new government, and I am concluding, is PESA or PISA, not the evaluation program, but this Emergency Academic Solidarity Program, a program for welcoming refugees from crisis-affected countries. So these initiatives, we try to demonstrate that represent a concrete, in the sense of crescere or being optimistic, steps towards realizing a more balanced and equitable global higher education landscape, with a new kind of internationalization of higher education, if I can say like that, driven by principle, and I'm concluding, of solidarity and shared development rather than solely competition or dependence on the North. Yeah, is that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario.
Thank you, Mario. Okay, I'm also take over from Mario then, and I'll make a stop before Abass takes over from me. And just want to introduce the project Abass and I have been working on with our colleague Teresa Frey from New York, who was unable to join us for this conference, but was working on the project with us. This is a project that looked at the implementation of the UNESCO Global Convention concerning the recognition of higher education qualification, which was adopted by UNESCO at its 40th annual conference in 2019. So it was unanimously embraced by UNESCO in 2019. All was left to do was for countries to then ratify the convention before it could come into force. And 4 years later, 2023, 20 countries had ratified the convention, and then the convention was able to come into force in 2023, obviously only for those 20 countries that had ratified it. So that's a very limited number of ratification, nothing very original by UNESCO standard. It's a fairly common process. There's usually quite a big gap between adoption and ratification. Ratification, of course, is a complex process that involves multiple steps, political and administrative, within countries, and this will vary a great deal from country to country. But also the stakes about ratifying a convention facilitating, again, the circulation of people around the world, including refugees, because there's a very important article in this global convention encouraging countries to facilitate mobility and the integration of people, of forced migrants into higher education systems in their host countries. And a number of other potentially contentious issues in the context of rising nationalism and of increasing reluctance of global South countries, as we just heard from Mario, of engaging with so-called processes, global processes that are effectively seen as being dominated by the North, by Northern, if I can put it this way, conceptualizations of inclusion, of global circulation, etc., even though the UNESCO has a much more global remit. So it is in this context, and also in a context where countries, traditionally the recipients of the benefits of global mobility, we're beginning to see things changing a bit. It is in this context that this Global Convention of UNESCO emerged and was presented as potentially an option, an opportunity for this global institution to position itself in a more determined way in the global regulation of mobility and in the reshaping the internationalization agenda in a more sustainable and inclusive way. We ask the question in this context, next slide, please, Vincent, of actually this convention, was it really needed? Who initiated it? Why would the dominant players of the global higher education field allow the introduction of yet another layer of regulation to a field that had been shaped over actually centuries to their own economic and symbolic benefits by decades of colonial and post-colonial domination, of QA measures and market regulation? Why would national parliament, facing mounting nationalistic pressures, want to ratify a convention openly promoting the recognition of qualifications held by refugees? What is it about this new framework that is not already addressed in those recently revised regional conventions that UNESCO had been promoted around the world before that new global convention began to be developed from the late 2000s? And what if the purpose of the Global Convention was actually less the standard instrument it carries than the ideological opportunity that the discursive space of the convention offers? So what if it was primarily about creating that space and developing those new concepts that would shape the future of higher education rather than really develop new regulatory framework. These were the kind of questions we asked when we first attended the convention approval in 2019, and then interviewed actors from institutions to the UNESCO itself and all the national delegations we could approach to actually explore the condition of the making of that convention. Abass.
Thank you very much, Yann. So
Next.
to pick up on that, I'll just move on from there. It's the idea of our conceptualization of the Global Convention as a discursive space, where we then see, borrowing from Jürgen Habermas's public sphere and also the critique of that conceptualization of the public as being inclusive, or as a place, or as a laboratory of idea, or a theater where we can achieve the public good through public talk or through a medium of talk. So, and we use the discursive space as a device for us to understand the emergence and the conditions in which the Global Convention has been, say, pursued by UNESCO as a space for people or countries to come together and discuss something that is a public good and has an overarching principle of being inclusive and leading a more inclusive, sustainable, and not the non-marketized and more idealistic position of UNESCO as compared to other, say, structures of global governance of higher education like the World Bank and the OECD. So, and we see this Global Convention also as an instrument in which UNESCO is trying to, as Yann has mentioned, to reclaim its position within the very idea of getting to, lead on the next steps in terms of how internationalization is going to emerge. And we did that through a network ethnography, following actors from when the convention was launched and to today. So we've now been able to look at how this discursive space is being represented across conversations with the actors and even the policy text itself to see what are the dimensions by which this debate of recognition for all is manifesting in power relations between member states, or say those that have ratified and those that are yet to ratify, and how they are managing this. So our first analysis is to understand the reasons for a global convention from a UNESCO's perspective. Why does UNESCO need sort of that framework overarchingly of globalizing regional conventions? And we see that the GC is one of that tools to regain that soft governance power within higher education, and also deployed through the non-marketized inclusive agenda of recognizing refugees' qualifications and prior learning or transnational education, or the idea of quality assurance, or strengthening those policy languages, of strengthening systems or making them more sustainable. So these are the first element of our analysis. And the second bit is the GSA, the Global Convention now, and the processes that led to adoption and the concomitant ratifications were presented from our discussion with actors within UNESCO and outside UNESCO as something consultative, open for negotiation, and inclusive in a way that we're trying to support systems to be able to, say, take a huge contribution or contribute to the very debate of, as Mario is just looking at how that South-South collaboration can emerge through a more globalized recognition regime. So, and the other bit is the third dimension, which is also linked to analysis where there's this discourse of the Global Convention or UNESCO as an institution being broad church, where there is a room for people to negotiate or influence agenda. And we've seen that coming through in how the elements of the convention are being selected. For instance, the Article 7, where we had some countries leading on the need to recognize qualification of refugees and all of that. And lastly, we also see this playing out in our content analysis of the Lisbon Recognition Convention, which is more closer to the global convention than all other recognition conventions that UNESCO has looked at. And then the question we are trying to, and then that content and the context in which that convention had been developed, you will think, yes, this is actually a pale copy of the Lisbon Convention, which is now becoming, as scholars have been describing, Lisbon going global, or say Bologna going global, sort of that debate. And we're going to be taking that further in our next slide. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll make a start. So from that analysis of the dynamics of the convention and of the ratification of the convention, we are proposing here just four sort of provocations or elements of discussion that we would like to promote here. The first one is that this convention has from the start been an idea developed by the Europeans for the Europeans. Here, we are suggesting that this so-called global convention promotes European recognition and QA regulations coming from Europe, that it is a carbon copy of the Lisbon Convention, even in its the finest details of its wording, and that even though the intentions are global and the language of the UNESCO to promote it is global, it is actually very much an expansion or a continuation of the expansion that had been already analyzed in the past of the Europeans through the lens of the UNESCO and the opportunity that the UNESCO sphere allows the Europeans to use. The second point is that these new standards and regulations are actually preparing the ground for an unequal insertion of the global south in the post-market international HE. The funding of the convention, of the meetings of the convention by countries of the global north, Japan, Norway, the EU, etc. And none of the meetings of the UNESCO would have been possible without that funding made available by a small number of countries who happen to be the signatories, the first signatories, obviously, and the first countries to ratify that convention is also suggesting that it's been tailored to meet their need and to further integrate countries of the global south in a mechanism whereby the students who come to these countries can then return to their country and take positions in the labor market. So there is here a regulation that is also driven by national agendas of a small number of countries. The third element is that all countries that are contributing, that have participated in the debates, whether from the global south or the global north, have their own national interest and are driven by their own national interest and are trying to make the most of the space offered by this convention. And this was evidenced by the work we've done, particularly with the Zambian Commission and with the Jordanian Commission, where it was obvious that all countries had an interest in being part of those debates, even if ultimately they were not to ratify the convention or have yet to ratify the convention. This is a secondary process as far as the global convention is concerned. And the last point is about the status of forced internationalization. The massive number of people in circulation around the world with higher education qualification and now knocking on the door of institutions, higher education institutions in their host country, or seeking a place in the skilled labor market of countries where they are landing. I mean, those people are challenging the traditional Western conceptualization of inclusion, and particularly the the relationship between those conceptualization and the actual mechanism of enrollment and participation in higher education in those countries. So these were the points that we wanted to highlight from this work we've done on the convention. And on this note, I'm going to hand over to Hanne for our last. It's Kirsten, I think, who's starting.
Yes. Hello, Hanne. Is it the sound okay?
Yes,
and so on?
Very well. Yeah, very good.
Okay, nice. And thank you very much for this opportunity to speak at the conference. I will say a few words that sort of will contextualize what we have to say, and I think it picks up very nicely on what has just been contributed by the former speakers. And I guess it's still Vincent who sort of shifts the slides. So I think we should take a look at the first slide. Yes. I will return a bit from what Yann was just talking about in relation to the UNESCO Global Recognition Convention, to one of the birthplaces of international academic mobility. Of course, this mobility has a lot of birthplaces, but I will focus on the one in which international academic mobility got connected to a set of utopian ideals, which can be subsumed under the concept of cosmopolitan internationalism. And the historian Glenda Luger speaks about that curiously utopian moment bracketed by the end of World War II and the onset of the Cold War. And that particular moment saw, of course, the establishment of important institutions like UNESCO and the Council of Europe that continued to set the frames for international academic mobility, and at the same time also connected this mobility to a set of values and principles that we could term cosmopolitan internationalism and the principle of world citizenship. And one of the first conventions coming out of these thoughtways, there's a focus on sharing, actually unconditional sharing, I would say, for the Council of Europe's member countries, that there's this idea that intellectual resources of member countries should be freely available to European youth. Also, hopes were connected to the ability of academic mobility to foster intercultural understanding. Even during the Cold War, there's a UNESCO convention on recognition coming directly in the aftermath of the Helsinki Final Act, also expressing hopes for mobility to foster intercultural understanding even across very deep political differences and of course very different political system under the age of opposing communist and capitalist political systems. Yeah, next slide, please. Yes, but of course these utopian ideals have met with difficult realities also after the end of the Cold War, as they were subjected to national economic and political rationales. Particularly this idea of sharing of intellectual resources has become contested in the meeting with national economic concerns. And of course also political events international political events, like for example the Russian invasion of Ukraine, create disruptions of international mobility, but also imaginations of what should the international classroom ideally look like can lead to conceptualizations of certain student groups as undesired. For example, Dutch university presidents once spoke of German and Chinese students as there being too many of them in the Dutch classrooms, and in Denmark there's been also a negative conceptualizations of the influx of students from Eastern Europe. Also, international students may not always behave in the desired way in terms of their choice of fields of study. They may be interested in social sciences and humanities instead of the more economically viable STEM programs. And in Denmark, there has been a criticism of international students returning too soon after graduation, so that the hosting country here, Denmark, would not be able to benefit economically from their contribution. This leads governments, such as in Denmark, to look for policies that could remedy this situation, and then they engage in policies of de-internationalization. This is, of course, difficult because states are still obliged by the conventions that they have ratified to open their programs to international students. So they engage in new governmentalities, we would argue. We would call this strategy the informal management of student numbers, because de-internationalization cannot be pursued by high-level policies, but can be pursued by making agreements with universities that result in closing of programs, changing of language, of instruction in programs, and the introduction of new entry requirements. At the same time, such measures cannot be observed from the outside. They are, so to speak, invisible, so the country can still emerge as fully compliant with the conventions that they have ratified. The only trace of perhaps de-internationalization policy that sort of is observable in the Danish case is that Denmark has not ratified the UNESCO Global Recognition Convention, unlike its Nordic neighbors, because this convention features under the heading of non-ratified conventions by the Danish government. And then over to you, Hanne.
Well, thank you very much. Just word of clarification, if anybody's not come across the term, de-internationalization, I believe, is a term that was invented by people like Sue Wright, myself, possibly Kirsten, involved in 2019, when we, in very panicky moves, tried to make sense of what was going on in Denmark. So if you've not come across that term, don't worry too much. I'm happy to explain. There is a logic to it, but you might need the explanation to understand why we're not just talking about, oh, we renationalize. It's not quite the same thing that's happening, but it reflects the dynamics specific to our context. I'm ending up by returning to the nation to nationalism, as I called it, because as I actually raised in the previous section, I think it's important to understand that we're not dealing with new nationalism. I've seen that explanation numerous times for what's going on in higher education politics, and I'm talking from a European context, of which I know best. And I think if we reduce the dynamics to new nationalism solely, I think we're not picking up on the traits that have been visible all along. And I can speak as somebody who ironically became involved in the language debate in Denmark 10 years ago, because of 15 actually. We published findings basically saying that the Danes are not as keen speaking English as they like everybody else to believe. And this made the media at a time where right-wing politicians, everybody were debating what was happening with internationalization in higher education, what was happening with our Danish language. Was Danish growing as a medium for academic knowledge production? If you check the statistics, you'll find that yes is the answer. We can now document that. But this debate was going on at the time. And this was at that time, we're talking 2007. This is when we should have been paid attention instead of ignoring it, going on with internationalization, globalization, interculturalism, the whole lot, pretending that nothing had happened. This debate was there all along. We just didn't attend to it. So I have two clusters of nationalisms here. I've sort of gathered what I've been reading about it. I have one cluster, which is what I call cultural nationalism, which is this idea about the national university, the nation building university, the university doing things for indigenous languages, doing things for heritage. I spoke to some of you about my background. I studied Scottish literature and history. Believe me, the Scottish universities, where what they're doing in terms of nation building, oh yeah, that's where you get your chair for Robert Burns. That's where you get departments of Scottish language, that kind of thing. So yes, it's also going on in this imperial context, that's the United Kingdom. Basically, we have the cultural nationalism going on. So international higher education can become a threat to our culture. These are discourses we're seeing right now in the Netherlands. This was some of the language used in Denmark, the debate on the English language, the debate on what do we read, which in Denmark is a debate about multilingualism. Once we internationalize, we stop reading other languages such as Swedish, Norwegian, German, etc., etc., etc. So it's moving from several languages to one language, English in our case. Is nation building? Because of course the universities have had that role. Our professions, political science, law, they are national professions training for a national administration, the bureaucratic state in the German case. They use Danish. Our national legislation is in Danish. We don't train lawyers in English. So there is, you could argue, a case for this nation building thing, that actually we are also training professionals in the Danish government administration. And don't get me wrong, I'm not supporting we don't have international higher education, but it's just where some of this coming from. Then we're getting the national protectionism, that actually we have to protect the national domain. Language laws in Norway, language laws in Iceland. I believe there are language laws in France, and Vincent will correct me if I'm wrong on this one. But there might also be policies favoring native students. What they try to do in Denmark is to introduce Danish as the criteria when accepting students into BA programs. So if you don't master Danish A, high school level, then you cannot enter Danish higher education. This is a smart way of keeping out more or less anybody but the Scandinavians, because Swedish and Norwegian are treated the same for policy reasons. We have special policies within the Nordic region, so we can't discriminate against other Scandinavian languages. So if you know Swedish, you're okay, you can enter Danish higher education, which this is interesting. So that's the culture thing. That's been there at least since the 19th century. It's coming and it's going a bit up and down, but it's there. Second one, I think, is actually what Kirsten talked about, what we heard before. This is realism when you're dealing with international relations. The nation state is doing what it can in its own interest. And I think a lot of internationalization, if we're honest, is about this. Attracting talent, getting international students to pay fees to finance research, getting the best people to enter specifically STEM. We don't really want people in the humanities, so that keeps me in a job. But basically, looking at the labor market, looking at where do we need talent, looking at nation branding. And there are 3 examples from the literature. Economic nationalism, I believe this is a term Brugger uses. It kind of overlaps with our term welfare nationalism. Economic nationalism, higher education must deliver value for money. So we like internationalization as long as it contributes to national wealth, basically. And this is actually the policy we see very much in Denmark at the moment. So we're not close to international students. We're open to the international students who are willing to go into the parts of higher education where we need people in the labor market. IT, engineering, that kind of thing. Welfare nationalism, the second one. This was a case of politicians being concerned that students, were they value for taxpayers' money? This is what Kirsten said. Did they stay in Denmark to get a job, to contribute, to pay taxes, to pay back whatever they cost? We have free higher education. We also have the possibility of European Union free movers claiming Danish government grants. That's the money that the politicians like to see graduates pay back. That's the welfare nationalist argument, which is essential here. Finally, I come across cosmopolitan nationalism, and I'll give a reference to those who are interested. But this is quite a new one in my collection of nationalisms, where we're using higher education in the national interest. This is why the Chinese government is very interested in participating in the PISA process, because the students do well. It's nation branding. They're doing well in that. So China comes out as this very successful nation in international relations. Same for South Korean international campuses. And I'm sending students to South Korea every semester, more or less. Well, the international campuses are quite an interesting phenomenon. They're English medium campuses. Of course, they hire people from the UK or the US or Australia to teach. And then they get exchange students to come there on exchange partnerships, for instance, with my University of Aalborg. And then they can sell international higher education to the Korean students, because they can then go to the English medium campus to meet the exchange students and be taught by native speakers from the US and the UK. very interesting phenomenon, which takes me to the end. So,
excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so you.
Camera is there.
Yeah, he doesn't really trust us. He wants to.
No.
He's right. It's for you. Actually, in this context of impoverished higher education, hold on to your laptop. And okay, thanks everyone. We are now to getting to the final part of this discussion where we put on screen some key questions from. We think they are key questions from our presentations. We hope they can help frame a little bit the conversation now. But as I said earlier, if you would like to venture outside those questions, you're more than welcome. So please, the floor is open now for comments, questions, provocations. Yes, please.
Hi,
Anna.
thank you.
Yeah.
I have two maybe questions, comments. One related to the discussion that was just on de-internationalization, which is very interesting. A question, Hanne, if there might be room, or do you think it's relevant to also talk about selective internationalization? So that's what came up in my mind. And then a question maybe for Mario. Hi, Mario, it's Hanne. How are you? Nice to see you. A question about, again, it's like the nuancing of internationalization. Might we be seeing like more of a regionalization when South American countries get together or certain language connected countries get together? Like, are we seeing a different kind of internationalization, which is connecting like-minded countries, for lack of a better term?
Where do we want to start? And therefore, Kirsten, you want to have a go?
well, I can do it, then Mario can.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's always room to add new nationalisms. Because I think there's a whole variety of them. I was actually thinking selective nationalism. I think the one I'm actually ending up with is still this cosmopolitan nationalism, which I just discovered recently. I think it's lovely because basically it's internationalizing in the name of the nation. But what else have we been doing? And I guess it is selective. You pick whatever works for you at the time. I mean, where are we making money? What contributes to national wealth? And the rest, well, who cares? If we can stop it, we can stop it. Sorry, it's a bit, it's cynical, but it's also, I think, realistic. Because I think perhaps those dynamics, if we close our eyes a bit to, because I love the idea of interculturalism. I love the idea of cosmopolitanism and all of that. But perhaps we have to be a bit more realistic. So did anybody but ourselves actually buy into this? Was this because we kept talking to people who were into international higher education and we all agreed and everything, the rest of the world didn't really care? I don't know. That's a big question. I'm sorry if that, I hope that kind of answered your question, Hanne.
Yeah. Mario, did you?
Hi, Anna. Thank you for your question. And it's very, very interesting question you said. It's when you think about the root of internationalization, at our universities, we are inherit this from medieval times, from Europe, even in Brazil, even in South America. So the first internationalization, if you remember the monks, is peregrinatio. It's necessary for a formation of a monk, of a priest, of an intellectual in medieval times to have the experience of peregrinatio, peregrination. It's interesting that there are several kinds of internationalization. And when I expose here some experience, it's just to say that these examples is those one that I could explain or we live is UNILA, UNILAMB, a student agreement with African countries and the Latin American countries. But we are several other experiences. One example, the first Brazilian university, the name is USP, the University of São Paulo. That foundation is possible because the elites, the Brazilian elites from São Paulo, went to Europe and invite intellectuals, professors to come here and say, oh, this is a new experience, the universitarian experience in Brazil. So we can say that there is several kinds of internationalization, but what that root, that is what kind or what is the values for that. For this, I remark or I highlight we have to have some values in internationalization. For that, solidarity, mutual respect, interculturality is important. This is the word we have to axe our projects of internationalization. And in the same way, I tried to demonstrate or show some utopias, and there are several utopias in the world, and I just pick some to remember our people have thoughts about the future, because utopias is the future project, the future, the possibility to live in another world, and what you can resume or try in a word is, if you don't live in a possible order and positive world, we are living in a dystopia world. We are realizing what is market, commodity, assetization, monetization. So it's not good when you think, yeah, I'm finishing my intervention just to say that, today we are knowing that the United States in a unilateral position say, oh, we live good in our nation. I know that it's not all United States people think like that, but you are living in a renationalization in the sense of very authoritarian terms. So my communication in the sense for provoking a new vision. But I know that you all know that, so it's just highlighting these concepts, utopias, and yes, thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mario. Thank you. I think you wanted.
Yeah. Michael Hölscher from Speyer University, Germany. When reading your first question here on the board and hearing about your concept of the different nationalisms, it came to my mind whether it would be a way forward to think from a systems perspective, thinking about different subsystems and thinking about what might be the political rationales, what might be economic rationales, what might be scientific rationales. Because we talked a lot about political rationales, but why do we think intrinsically from a scientific perspective, what is the good in international cooperation, or what might speak against it? And I don't think we can avoid thinking about a trade-off, but maybe this would help us to organize the arguments of the different field logics. Maybe. Way forward.
Thank you. Thanks for that point. Anyone would like to comment or
Do you think that might be feasible? Yeah. So that's a question. Sorry.
I think any rethinking is important, because I think we need to really think with what is there, and I think the subsystem is one. And I think the idea of actually doing the range of the nationalisms, I think we need to start engaging with them and start to engaging with the what specific arguments that they're presenting, instead of using these broad terms like neo-nationalism. And I think actually the subsystems, because we need to, if we want to keep the system open, and we do, and we have, the system is not closed, at least not in my country, it's not in Europe. So I think we need to keep that in mind. We need to engage with the kind of discourse that the politicians are using. So if they're using the economic discourse, oh, labor market, okay, we'll have to learn to play by those rules. Instead of just say, oh, that's another new nationalism, they just want to keep the borders. No, let's keep those terms for those who are actually in that group. And let's look at the welfare nationalism, the economic argument, the mobility, because they're all, you're absolutely right, they do different things. So if we want to be able to influence and have a qualified discussion of this, I think we do need to actually engage with it as different systems and accept that, well, not all politicians are the same, not all educators are the same, not all universities are the same, and different contexts, different discourses, or quite possibly.
Just if I may, I mean, there's this idea of the, the rationale, the various kind of rationale, and it was someone in the last panel made a good, point about like the economic rationale is stepping back, which can be a good news for, something that people were actually waiting for. But then there's a political rationale stepping in, and there are various political rationale made. So we can see. I've been like probably all my career pleading for public funding, and what you're seeing in the state as well now, for example, shows that public funding can be also problematic in terms of how it is used. But I see public funding as a shield to try to reconcile the rationale. So I don't, I an important point, and the rationale is as well. I'm aware that the public good and global public good, and I think there's a connection between that and public funding. I mean, your market won't make the case for the public good in that sense.
Okay, I think 1, 2.
Hi, I'm Spectrum from Isiaka Masters. Just in terms of, because I think there's been changes to like graduate visas and stuff. I just want to understand where you think this fits within nationalism, like your costs.
No, I think.
Sorry, can you just repeat this?
So there have been changes to the graduate visas and like more like restrictions to it. I just want to understand where you think this fits within the costs of nationalism.
Okay, and Abass, do you want to make a start on that one?
I mean, I was just going to comment on the, but I think within the UK context, where you have, the description of the hostile environment that from the years of Theresa May, in terms of the reactions to the nationalization of national state, or even migrants generally, and we did see where, in the case of Denmark, where nation states want. Denmark and Netherlands want international students to stay, but you have the very opposite in the case of the UK, where you come and then we want to have a net migration where those are coming and leaving. So you have that contradiction between, as much as we want to open up, we also want to close up. I think that's the bit that I can see debate around. Close the border, open the border, sustain the system, and those contradictions. And just to connect with the other point I was going to make about the regionalization of mobility, where UNESCO, when you ask people, when we did our research, trying to understand, why do we need to have a global convention alongside new set of regional conventions? And we're letting us realize that we can't eliminate the regions because we are having the global, or because the global is not here. So we need to develop stronger regions where people are able to migrate or move within regions. Say in the case of Latin America or in Africa, or having these pockets of regional organizations. enabling regional migrations or for higher education. And people looking at the impact of internationalization on the environment from the sustainable perspective have been saying, okay, we need more regional movement where we can offset the impact of internationalization on the environment. So that's also another debate that's been out of the very economic and political rationales for internationalization. But then probably more regions, but then what are the focus of these regions in how they approach internationalization? Is it for teaching or for research or for other say scientific collaborations and all that? So that's what I was going to add, and in response to this question on regional internationalization.
And there is no huge contradiction between, it's not necessarily seen as a contradiction that countries may have been among the first ones to promote and to ratify the Global Convention, including Article 7 on facilitating the integration of forced migrants, and putting all the barriers, creating all the visa policies that are actually creating a hostile environment for migrants, including international students. So it's quite interesting that some of the countries that were very vocal in promoting the Global Convention in terms of global inclusion, in terms of facilitating the integration and facilitating the circulation of everyone around the world, were among the ones introducing new measures to restrict access to their higher education system. So there is no necessarily big contradiction, because the translation of a global convention in national policy is a very complex process that takes a very long time, and is, for instance, in the UK, the ratification of the global convention was never a problem. When you read some of the articles of that global convention, you would think, what, in a context of the conservative being in the government and the creation of the hostile environment, how come they were among the first to ratify such convention? It's because the convention was for them an instrument of promoting themselves on the global stage rather than a new policy regulating access to their internal market. Did you want a footnote to your question?
Do you think that by them introducing these restrictions or these new measures, that they thought would be a benefit to the society in terms of saving taxpayers' money, or the other perspective?
The UK government? Yeah. Do you want to have a go at this one? Why the restriction on
international
visas, etc.? Yeah.
I mean, international students were part of the immigration targets, and so that's, there's always been these tensions between income generations, so more international students, and on the other side, so foreign office versus, I would say, income generation versus immigration target at the time, which was kind of clear, policy from the government for political, in terms of political strategy or game.
Simon, do you want on this point?
Yeah. I think these Anglophone governments have been driven by migration politics, migration resistance in the electorate. They're polling on that all the time. The Red Wall seats decided the last election. It was between the Tories and the Labor Party in the Red Wall seats. So what the Red Wall seats think is really important, and they're very kind of racially sensitive Red Wall seats. So I just think they wanted to, in restricting dependents entry, without restricting entry of students directly, they knew they would lose some students, but they wanted to cut the dependents out. They wanted to reduce the number of non-white and non-national, non-citizen people coming across the border to reduce, migration traffic into the UK. Simple. They can't cut economic migration. They can't cut family reunion. They have limited capacity and limited numbers anyway to play with refugees. So the way you cut numbers is international, and international dependence are the soft part of international. So that's what they did. The Canadian one is the bigger cut, and I think more strange in some ways. They've taken out 40% of student numbers.
and some of the fluctuation I've shown in the graph, for example, for France, it's also the case. I mean, you know, visa policy are clear, that's the role for government, or to always, like, I mean, it's often connected to economic crisis as well and reaction to electorators.
Yeah, I'm going to just add before that. I think Finland, we expect things to see change. We're expecting change in Sweden because Sweden's taking a lot of the students who would formerly have gone to Denmark. Norway always comes out in this country signing everything, but what you need to know is that most of the higher education in Norway is performed in Norwegian, so they're effectively closing off Norway, so they can sign anything in that. And that's what we also saw with refugee flows. So very few go to Norway, very few go to Iceland, which is why it's theory a lot of the time for them. Because I remember we did a Viva for a PhD doing English medium education in Norway, and the numbers are very, very small compared to Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. So there are those differences, which in order to know why they're signing things, that's part of the explanation too.
And the irony is that the president of the Peru of the Global Convention is actually Norwegian, and he's been very forefront of, you know, this global idea, recognition for all agenda of the UNESCO, and you could say at national level it's a very different debate. And I think there's this increasing nexus between higher education and migration, and then we're saying that migration is no longer in that backdrop, it's now part of that debate. So when you have higher education, then you think migration. When you have migration, you think higher education. You have that parenthesis. So I think that's another dimension to.
Okay. Ahmed, finally, you're.
I'm Ahmed, researcher in the education department here at Oxford. And it's interesting, really, what you have just discussed. And I have a question around the Global South internationalization and the collaboration between the different countries, you know, and different forms of collaboration, whether this is an agentic response to westernized models of internationalization or whether it's a forced option, you know, due to geopolitical tensions, and also the different types of nationalisms or the selective, let's say, internationalization. So I'm wondering to what extent these forms or ways of thinking around internationalization really respond to the, let's say, the mission of internationalization, and how these can create other new divides in our world at the moment and perpetuate, you know, those divisions among different countries.
Okay, thank you very much. I will ask Mario if you can take this one first. And at the same time, we've got a few points made in the chat that I can read from here. Mario, one relates, in passing, if you can address that, relates to the relevance of the notion of the Global South in this discussion.
Good, thank you. Firstly, it's very interesting discussion, very interesting question. Firstly, when we think about the Global South, we have to say that there is a difference in attraction too, because some characteristics reinforce other characteristics. What I mean is our preoccupation, our worry is a little bit different. So the internationalization is different too. In this moment, Brazil would like to attract international students. Is different from Europe in this moment. For us, it's very interesting when you have foreign students in our campus. It is because we have not so much. We have few international students, and we know that when you have international students in a class or in a campus, there is, because Brazil is a very large country, so in the same time we have some curiosity for other people, curiosity of other people, other countries. So it's just to say that internationalization today in Brazil, we have not the same worry, and it's important. sorry. Sorry for that. I'm home. This curiosity is stimulating our Brazilian students to see there is another world, another culture. So interculturality here is important in this moment. And for public schools, public higher education is free of charge, our universities. And sometimes they could have some scholarship, like the two programs I described. Even more, furthermore, like that, for us, and I think Brazil and Latin America, we speak Portuguese and Spanish. In South America, Brazil is one country, but it is half of population of South America. So there are several countries in South America that speak Spanish. So just to finish my words is Portuguese, Spanish, and even the people came from Europe or Asia or other country would be very interesting, but it's very restrictive, the attraction for Brazilian university, not for quality, I imagine, because public university is very, very good university, but we are a little bit isolated in the world. Even I try to say Brazil is a good country to live, a good country to study, but yeah, I don't know if I very well answered the question, but just to say that the global south is a very good concept to describe our situation, and at the same time is global south is a very good axe to try to attract interculturality for Latin American and Brazil culture.
Thank you. Thanks, Mario. I think we're reaching the end of our conversation for now. I'm just going to give the last word to Wen. I hope it's not is it a question or a comment you wanted to make? If it's a comment, it's perfect. We give you the conclusion.
It's a comment.
Thank you very much. And we will finish on that point.
Vincent. Thank you. I want to make a very quick comment for the last question. Well, if we try to answer this question, I think we need to do more research on individual universities, because universities they have different geographical locations, and they are also in different position. They have different resources, so different universities they have their own agency to develop, to balance between the nation demanding and also the global knowledge exchange. For example, there are some universities located in the southeast of China, which is very close to Thailand, Laos, Vietnam. So yeah, they have their own strategy to attract international students and train. They are very special skills for them. And also there are some polytechnic universities at the third tier, in the hierarchy of Chinese university system. Some of them enroll even much more number of international students than the top research universities located in those cosmopolitan cities like Beijing or Shanghai. And they train them, very practical mechanical skills or with architectural skills, agricultural skills. So my point is very easy, that most of the research on internationalization of higher education focuses on those top research universities. Well, there are a lot of universities and also individual scientists. They have their own agency. So I mean, more research is needed, because for these universities and individual scientists, how they develop their agency, it's kind of under researched. So more research. That's why.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Best way of concluding that discussion. Thank you.